These are 5 things every beginner needs to know about programming their first 2-meter 70cm or VHF UHF ham radio. Let's get started. Number 1, finding the resources to program repeaters into your radio. Now we will get into repeaters versus simplex operation in just a few moments. But before then, we need to prepare ourselves, and the best way to prepare ourselves is to have the resources available to find local repeaters in the area that we're going to be. Now there are 2 main ways that I choose to find this information, and number 1 is the convenience of the internet. Repeaterbook.com is a great resource which will allow you to look up repeaters in your area by proximity search or just by browsing your area directly. But what happens if the internet goes down? You might not have access to those repeaters, and that's why it's nice to have a book. Now I know this book's a little old. I think it's a 2008 model. Yeah, 2008. Now I would recommend having an up-to-date book, and the reason is sometimes information in repeaters change. And if you have a book that's well over 10 years old, you might not have the most current information to connect to certain repeaters in the area that you'll be visiting or that you live. With that being said, both Repeater Book and the Repeater Directory have valuable information about how to get started and get set up on the repeater, which brings us to step number 2. Number 2, programming both repeaters and simplex frequencies into your radio. Many times a new amateur radio operator might just program repeater information into his radio or her radio, but might forget simplex operations or vice versa. You might not even understand completely what repeaters are versus what simplex is, so maybe I should take a step back, and explain that a little further. First things first, simplex in the most common form is talking direct to radios. Think of when you were a kid and you had a walkie-talkie. You'd be on the playground and you'd be talking to somebody and you would directly talk to him via the walkie-talkie. That's exactly or pretty much what simplex operations is. But then you have repeater operations, and the best way to look at this is picture a tower down the road and you have a radio here and a radio here, but maybe there's a mountain in between you two and you guys can't talk simplex or direct. So you send a signal up to that repeater, and that repeater in turn sends the signal back out on another frequency, therefore repeating the signal, and your friend could hear it on the other side of the mountain. Now it's important to have both simplex and repeaters programmed into your radio, and the reason for that is quite a few things, but one of the main reasons would be if you're on a repeater and you're close enough to somebody to talk to them via simplex, you might not want to repeat that signal 30, 40 miles away. And also it's kind of considered common courtesy to get off of the repeater if you could talk directly. And the number 3 thing I think you need to know is about offsets. Now a lot of times I think we'll find new ham radio operators, amateur radio operators who just think they could put in the frequency they see on a website or in a book and everything else is going to work out and figure itself out. And maybe that'll be the case consistently down the road, but that's not how it quite works now. So we need to know our offsets. Now I'm going to explain first something called the downlink, and that's the frequency that you're typically listening to hear traffic from a repeater. For example, my downlink in my area was 145.330. Now I'm listening on that, but when I transmit, I'm not going to transmit on that same frequency. I'm going to transmit on the uplink, or where I'm sending my voice information to. Typically on 2 meters, it's plus 0.6 megahertz or minus 0.6 megahertz. And on 70 centimeters, it's around a 5 megahertz plus or minus offset. So when you look on Repeater Book and you see that there's an uplink and a downlink frequency, you now know that downlink's what you're going to program in to listen to, and really your offset is going to be the uplink. Next up on our list is the Continuous Tone-Coded Squelch System, or CTCSS. Now I'm going to give you a brief rundown of what this is. Essentially, in very simple terms, it's a tone that generates from a radio. And that tone is nearly indistinguishable or inaudible by the ear. Now that tone, when transferred, for example, to a repeater, the repeater will be listening for that tone and that tone only. If it doesn't hear that tone, it will reject any audio that's coming in. If it does hear that tone and it's the same tone as the repeater, it will allow that traffic in. Linked below, I did include a list of standard CTCSS tones, but I do want to give an example of Simplex and where this could be somewhat confusing or create some complications to normal people. Now, this doesn't mean that by any means your line is secure if you have a tone enabled, because anybody else who's listening to that tone could still hear your conversation. So let's say, for example, we have individual 1 and individual 2. Now they're talking direct to each other, Simplex, as we talked about earlier. If individual 1 is operating with a CTCSS tone enabled on transmit and receive of 88.5, and individual 2 is operating at 107.2, there's going to be some issues. And the reason is this guy might be transmitting, but this guy's not hearing anything. There's no audio. Well, that's because the tone's set incorrectly on one of these two. So if they both have 107.2, they can both communicate to each other. Now, if individual 3 came into the picture and he had 88.5, he would hear the individual transmitting 88.5, and he would hear his voice completely fine. But then again, 107.2 still wouldn't hear those conversations. Again, it's not a secure system, and it by no means is any kind of system to prevent people from listening to your conversations, but it is very nice to have that ability to tone out other people when you only want to talk to 1 or 2 people, especially in an area with high frequency or high traffic. And one of the final things I want to talk about today, number 5, is knowing the difference between analog and digital. When you go online or you check your book and you look to see what repeaters are available in your area, you might find one and you might be surprised to hear this. From your least expensive handy-talkie radio all the way to your most expensive VHF UHF radio from Yaesu or ICOM, most if not all of them do some sort of analog signals. But the problem we get into is when we have these digital signals and all you're hearing is that weird tone again. It's important to note that there are different digital standards such as DMR or C4FM, some people call it Fusion, D-Star, and P25. And the problem is if I have an ICOM radio, for example, and I have a Yaesu radio, and I'm trying to send digital signals to each other, they're not going to work. And the reason they're not going to work is because the ICOM is made for D-Star, and the Yaesu is its own standard, C4FM, and they weren't made to decode and encode each other's digital signal. So it's important to know that if you have an analog-only radio, you're going to hear the digital signal, but you can't decode it. If you have an ICOM radio, you'll still hear that digital signal, but you won't be able to decode it, and so forth. When checking out Repeater Book or your repeater directory, there should be an indication whether or not that repeater is digital only, or if it's an analog repeater, or if it's a combination. I wanted to provide this information to you as a beginner, or you as the viewer, or maybe you're just getting back into the hobby. It's been a while, so this is a refresher to you. But the reason I wanted to provide this information is these things I just talked about are the fundamentals of programming your ham radio. And as a bonus, I'll add a number 6 in there. Most every handy-talkie radio out there now programs the same way. And with these fundamentals, you should have an easier time programming your radio. If you're not exactly sure how to program your radio and you're not good with instructions, for example, reading like me, go on to YouTube and search that model number and programming your radio. You will find that there's probably quite a few people out there who have actually made a whole walkthrough tutorial on how to program that specific radio. Anyway, I'm Ham Radio Dude. If you did like what you saw, please consider subscribing. It really does help me in the YouTube algorithm, really helps me to produce more videos and kind of get an overall feel of what people are watching on my channel and what I need to continue making more videos on. So until next time, 73.
Quickly, I wanted to give a big shout out to this month's channel members and thank you so much for being operator statuses: N5 SKT Don, Jim FEP Labs Radio, WQ9F Ham Radio Kevin, and Ham World Online. They all do have YouTube channels, which I'll link below. Check them out.